Why does popcorn pop? Tiny explosions inside every kernel. Have you ever stared at a popcorn kernel and wondered how something so small and hard can suddenly explode into a fluffy white snack? That loud pop you hear isn't magic, it's a tiny explosion happening right before your eyes. But what exactly causes it? And why doesn't every type of corn pop the same way? Popcorn is a simple snack, but what happens when it pops is surprisingly amazing. A small, hard yellow kernel suddenly turns into a big, white, fluffy piece of popcorn with a loud pop. Sound. This feels almost like magic, but it is really science at work. Inside every popcorn kernel, heat causes pressure to build up until the kernel bursts open in a tiny explosion. Not all corn can pop. Corn on the cob, sweet corn, and animal feed corn will not turn into popcorn when heated. Popcorn comes from a special type of corn called Z. maize everta. This type of corn has a very hard outer shell and the right amount of water inside. These two features make popping possible. Over many years, farmers selected corn plants that popped better. Little by little, popcorn became very good at doing what it does best, exploding when heated. So popcorn is special because humans helped shape it through farming. A popcorn kernel may look small and simple, but it has several important parts. The outside of the kernel is called the hull, or pericarp. This shell is very hard and strong. It keeps things inside the kernel trapped. Inside the hull is the starch, which makes up most of the kernel. The starch is mixed with a small amount of water, usually about 13 to 14% of the kernel's weight. There is also a tiny part called the germ, which would grow into a corn plant if the kernel were planted. The most important parts for popping are the hard outer shell, the starch, and the water trapped inside. Water is the key reason popcorn pops. Every popcorn kernel contains a small amount of water hidden inside the starch. When the kernel is heated, this water gets hotter and hotter. At first, nothing seems to happen, but as the temperature rises, the water inside the kernel turns into steam. Steam takes up much more space than water. Because the hull is very hard and does not let steam escape, pressure starts to build up inside the kernel. Without water, popcorn cannot pop. If a kernel dries out too much, it will not explode. That is why old popcorn sometimes does not pop well. When popcorn is heated on a stove, in a microwave, or with hot air, heat moves from the outside of the kernel to the inside. The kernel slowly warms up. As the temperature increases, the water inside turns into steam. At the same time, the starch inside begins to soften. The kernel is now like a tiny pressure cooker. Heat keeps rising, steam keeps forming, and pressure keeps increasing. The hull is strong, but it is not unbreakable. As more steam forms, the pressure inside the kernel becomes very high. Scientists have found that the pressure inside a popcorn kernel can reach about 9 times the normal air pressure around us. The temperature inside can rise above 180 degrees Celsius, about 356 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a lot of pressure for something so small. The kernel is now holding in hot steam that desperately wants to escape. The hull stretches as much as it can, but eventually it reaches its limit. When the pressure becomes too much, the hull suddenly breaks. This happens very fast, in a tiny fraction of a second. When the hull cracks open, the trapped steam bursts out quickly. This sudden release of pressure causes the soft, hot starch inside to explode outward. The kernel turns inside out as the starch expands. This is the pop. You hear, it is the sound of the hull breaking and steam rushing into the air. Each pop is a tiny explosion. Before popping, the starch inside the kernel is hard and tightly packed. When the kernel pops, the starch becomes soft and stretchy because of the heat and water. As the steam escapes, it pushes the starch outward, creating air pockets. When the starch cools, it hardens again, but now it has a light, fluffy shape full of tiny holes. This structure is similar to foam. That is why popcorn is so light and airy compared to the hard kernel it came from. Most popcorn kernels are yellow, so it may seem strange that popped popcorn is white. This happens because of how light interacts with the popped starch. After popping, the starch forms many thin walls with air inside. Light hits these surfaces and scatters in all directions. Because all colors of light are reflected evenly, the popcorn looks white. So the color change is not from burning or cooking, it is from the way the starch structure reflects light. Why some kernels do not pop. After popping a batch of popcorn, there are usually a few hard kernels left at the bottom. These are often called old maids. They fail to pop for a few reasons. Sometimes the kernel does not have enough water inside. Without enough moisture, there is not enough steam to build pressure. Other times, the hull may have a small crack that lets steam leak out slowly. When this happens, pressure never gets high enough to cause an explosion. Uneven heating can also stop kernels from popping properly. Why oil helps popcorn pop? Popcorn can pop without oil, but oil often helps. Oil transfers heat well and helps the kernels heat evenly. This makes it easier for the pressure inside each kernel to rise quickly and evenly. Oil also allows the temperature to go higher than boiling water, which helps the starch soften properly before the kernel pops. In microwaves, the water inside the kernel absorbs microwave energy directly, heating the kernel from the inside. Different methods use different kinds of heat, but the popping process is the same. Why popcorn pops so suddenly? Once the kernel reaches the right temperature and pressure, popping happens almost instantly. The hull breaks, steam rushes out, and the starch expands in a flash. High-speed cameras show that popcorn can jump into the air when it pops. This happens because the force of the explosion pushes the kernel upward. For a moment, popcorn acts like a tiny rocket. The speed of the pop is part of what makes popcorn exciting to watch and listen to. That is one reason it fills a bowl quickly, but does not weigh much. Why everything has to be just right? For popcorn to pop perfectly, everything must be balanced. The kernel needs the right amount of water. The hull must be strong and unbroken. The starch must be able to soften and expand. The heat must be high enough and spread evenly. If one part of this system fails, the kernel will not pop. This is why popcorn popping feels almost magical. It depends on many things working together at the right moment. Why people love popcorn. Popcorn is not just food. It is an experience. The sound of popping builds excitement. The smell fills the room. Watching hard kernels turn into fluffy popcorn feels satisfying. Popcorn is simple, affordable, and fun. Knowing the science behind it makes it even more interesting. Popcorn pops because water inside the kernel turns into steam when heated. The steam builds pressure inside a strong shell until the shell breaks. When it breaks, the starch inside explodes outward and cools into a fluffy shape. Each piece of popcorn is the result of a tiny explosion that happens in a fraction of a second. What starts as a hard seed becomes a light, crunchy snack through heat, pressure, and perfect timing. So the next time you hear popcorn popping, remember you are listening to hundreds of tiny explosions, all happening just to make a delicious snack. Love learning the science behind everyday things? Hit subscribe for more videos like this. And drop a comment below what everyday food should we explain next?